withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. What are your thoughts on how that was executed? How could it have been done better?
Yeah, an important question. I mean, I would preface all this by saying, as I noted, I think the war was a mistake. I had hoped the war would end sooner. I think there were different exit routes all along the way. Again, I think there were lots of policy choices in September, in October, when the war began. There were choices in December 2001. So we could look at almost every 6-month stopping point and say, we could have done differently. As it turns out, though, I mean, the way it played out, it's been catastrophic. And I think the Biden administration has remained unaccountable for the scale of the strategic and humanitarian and ethical failure that they're responsible for.
Well, okay, let's lay out the full. There's George W. Bush.
Yeah.
There's Barack Obama. There's Donald Trump.
That's right.
There's Biden.
Yeah.
So they're all driving this van, and there's these exits, and they keep not taking the exits, and they're running out of gas.
Yeah.
I do this all the time, thinking, where am I going to pull off? I'll go to till it's empty. How could it have been done better, and what exactly, how much suffering have all of the decisions along the way caused? What are the long-term consequences? What are the biggest things that concern you about the decisions we've made in both invading Afghanistan and staying in Afghanistan as long as we have?
I mean, if we start at the end, as you proposed, the horrific scenes of the airport, that was just one dimension. I think in the weeks to come, I mean, we're going to see Afghanistan implode. There are lots of signs that malnutrition, hunger, starvation are going to claim tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives this winter. And I think there is really nothing, there's no framework in place to forestall that.
What is the government, what is currently the system there? What's the role of the Taliban? So there could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands that starve, either just almost the famine or starve to death. So this is economic implosion. This is political implosion. What's the system there like, and what could be the one, some inkling of hope?
Right. The Taliban sit in control. That's unique. When they were in power in the 1990s, from 1996 2001, they controlled some 85 to 90% of the country. Now they own it all, but they have no budget. The Afghan banking system is frozen. So
the financial system is a mess.
And it's frozen by the U.S. because the U.S. is trying to use that lever to exert pressure on the Taliban. And so the ethical quandaries are, of course, legion, right? Do you release that money to allow the Taliban to shore up their rule, right? The Biden administration has said no, but the banks aren't working. If you're in California, you want to send $100 to your cousin so she can buy bread, you can't do that now. It's almost impossible. There are some informal networks that are moving some stuff, but there are bread lines. The Taliban government is incapable, fundamentally, just of ruling. I mean, they can discipline people on the street. They can force people into the mosque. They can shoot people. They can beat protesters. They can put out a newspaper. They're great at diplomacy, it turns out. They can't rule this country. So essentially, the hospitals and the kind of healthcare infrastructure is being managed by NGOs that are international. But many people had to leave, and the Taliban have impeded some of that work. They've told adult women essentially to stay home, right? So a big part of the workforce isn't there. So the supply chain is kind of crawling to a halt. Trade with Pakistan and its neighbors, I mean, it's kind of a transit trade economy. It exports fruits. Pakistan has been closing the border because they're anxious about refugees. They want to exert pressure on the international community to recognize the Taliban because the Pakistan want the Taliban to succeed in power because they see that in Pakistan's national interest, especially through the lens of its rivalry with India. So the Pakistani security institutions are playing a double game. And essentially, the Afghan people are being held hostage. And so the Taliban are also saying, if you don't recognize us, you're going to let tens of millions of Afghans starve.
So to which degree is Taliban, like, who are the Taliban? What do they stand for? What do they want? Obviously, year by year, this changes. So what is the nature of this organization? Can they be a legitimate, peaceful, kind, respectful government sort of holder of power, or are they fundamentally not capable of doing so?
Yeah. I mean, the briefest answer would be that they are a clerical / military organization. They have, this is kind of a imperfect metaphor, but years ago, a German scholar used the term caravan to describe them. Mm-hmm. And that has some attractive elements because different people who joined the Taliban for different purposes at different times. But today, and people tell us, scholars who know more about the movement than I have said, listen, the Taliban is this kind of hodgepodge of different actors and people and competing interests. And I think, so we have a lot of scholars who say, listen, it's polycentric. It's got people in this city and that city and so on. I think actually, I was always very skeptical. How do they know this? I mean, this is an organization that doesn't want you to know where that money comes from and so on. But I would say now that we have a clearer picture of what has happened, I'd say they were a astoundingly well-organized clerical military organization that has a very cohesive and enduring ideology, which is quite idiosyncratic if we zoom out and continue the conversation we're having about Islam and how we think about radicalism and who's drawn to what. People throw different terms around to describe the Taliban. Some use a term that links it to a kind of school of thought born in the 19th century in India, the Deobandi school. But if you look at their teachings, it's very clear now, I think, that these labels, it's like saying, you're an MIT guy. Well, what does that mean? I mean, MIT is home to dozens of different, potentially, kinds of intellectual orientations, right? I mean, attaching the name of a school doesn't quite capture. I mean,
it's complicated. I mean, actually, MIT is interesting because I would say MIT is different than Stanford, for example.
Yeah.
I think MIT has a more kind of narrow.
Yeah, I hear you. Bad analogy on my part, maybe.
Well, no, it's interesting because I would argue that there's some aspect of a brand like Taliban or MIT, no relation, that has a kind of the brand results in the behavior of enforces a kind of behavior on the people, and the people feed the brand. And there's a loop. I think Stanford is a good example of something that's more distributed. There's sufficient amount of diversity in all kinds of centers and all that kind of stuff that the brand doesn't become one thing. Yeah. And MIT is so engineering. It's
I think
than that.
Okay, so Taliban. Scratch MIT. Let's scratch Stanford too, because I think Stanford's more like MIT than you might imagine. But
isn't Taliban? Isn't it pretty? I don't think there's a diversity.
So sorry. So just to rephrase. So people say, oh, the Deobandi school. I'm like, what is that? I mean, but the Taliban they're an ethnic movement. They represent a vision of Pashtun power, right? The Pashtuns are people who are quite internally diverse, who actually speak multiple dialects of Pashto, who reside across the frontier of Pakistan and Afghanistan. There are Pashtuns who live all over the planet, right? There's a community in Moscow, California, everywhere, right? So it's a global diaspora of sorts. Pashtuns have a kind of genealogical imagination so that lots of Pashtuns can tell you the names of their grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And that's kind of there's a sense of pride in that. Pashto language is a kind of core element of that identity, but it's not universal. So, for example, you can meet people who say, I am Pashtun, but I don't know Pashto. So as you claw away at this idea, it's amorphous. It also means different things to different people at different times. So saying the Taliban are Pashtun requires lots of qualifiers, because lots of Pashtuns will say, no, I have nothing to do with the Taliban. I hate those people. So the Taliban tried to mobilize other Pashtuns with limited success, but their core membership is almost exclusively Pashtun. And they say, no, we represent Afghans. We represent pious Muslims. And so in recent 2-3 years, they've gone further to say, no, we have ethnic groups. We have Uzbeks, we have Tajiks, we have Hazaras. And in the north of Afghanistan, in recent years, they did do a bit better at drawing in people who were very disaffected because of the government, and they were able to diversify their ranks somewhat. But if you watch August 15 and who they've appointed, what language they've used, how they've presented themselves, it's clear that they are Pashtun, they are male, and they are extremely ideologically cohesive and disciplined, I'd say. Right? So I think that a lot of the polycentrism, blah, blah, some of that stuff was a way to fight a war. They are fundamentally, a guerrilla movement. They see themselves as kind of pious Robin Hoods. The rhetoric is very much about taking from the rich, taking from the privileged, giving to the poor, being on the side of the underdog, fighting against evil. And so, I mean, their bag, if you like, their thing, their central theme, their brand is about public morality. And so their origin story, going back to 1994, is that they interceded, they broke up a gang of criminals who were trying to rape people. And so there's a very interesting kind of like emphasis on like sexuality and on public morality, and really being the core of like, we're going to restore order and public morality. And how that translates into governance is something they've never sorted out. I mean, how do you run a banking system if your intellectual priorities are really about, the length of a beard? and then their path to power in a kind of abstract sense. I mean, a lot of that was very much driven by, if you like, propagating the promise of martyrdom. Mm-hmm. And that sounds, I don't mean to say that in a way that to make it sound ridiculous, to make it sound like it's, a moral judgment. It's simply, I think, a fact. It's a fact of their appeal that they promised young men who have known nothing else but studying in certain schools, if at all, but they've known fighting, and they've known victimization. And this isn't, I'm not asking for like sympathy for them, but I think the reality is that a lot of what we know about the kind of foot soldiers is that they lost families in bombings, in airstrikes, in night raids. Orphans have always been a stream. Living in all male society, not knowing girls, not knowing women, hearing things from outside about places like Kabul. And so there's always been this kind of urban rural dimension. It's not just that, but I think there's a whole imagination that being Taliban captures. And the whole martyrdom thing is really, it's I think to any religious person, I mean, it's not a bizarre idea. I mean, it animates, so many global traditions, but I think when you try to tell like an army colonel, right, if you were to have a conversation with, a U.S. Marine about this, I mean, some would get it from their own religious backgrounds, but I think it's an alien idea, but I think it's essential to kind of stretch our imagination to understand that's attractive. And now one of the dilemmas going forward is that they've got to pivot from martyrdom, and some have told foreign journalists, I mean, it's good that we're in charge now. We're going to build a proper state, but it's kind of boring. I want to keep fighting. Maybe I'll do that in Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that they are expressing that thought. Some are not even honest sufficiently with themselves to express that kind of thought. If you're a fighter, it's like you see that with a bunch of fighters or professional athletes. Once they retire, they don't know. It's boring. And so like if the spirit of the Taliban, even the best version of the Taliban is to fight, is to be martyrs, is to paint the world as good and evil, and you're fighting evil and all that kind of stuff. That's difficult to imagine how they can run an education system, a banking system, respect all kinds of citizens with different backgrounds and religious beliefs and women and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, and they've walked into Kabul and other major cities. Some of them are young; they didn't know those places, but also the very important obstacle for them is that Afghan society has changed. I mean, it's not what, even for the older guys, it's not what they knew in the 1990s. Some always had some ambivalence about the capital, but now it's totally different. I mean, they've been shocked to see. I think, to me, one of the most striking features of the last few weeks has been that women have come out on the streets and have stood in their faces and said, we demand rights, we demand education, we demand employment, and these foot soldiers are paralyzed. They're not sure.
They don't know what to do with women, period.
Yeah, yeah, and they don't know what to do with being yelled at and having someone stick their fingers in their faces. I mean, this is not what they've imagined. And so I think, and at this juncture, there are still foreign cameras around. So they have committed acts of violence against women, against journalists. They've beaten people. Yeah. They've disappeared people.
Even with cameras around, even in this tense period.
Yeah, but I think that when the cameras, retreat, and that's likely to happen, it's going to get much worse, I think. So the challenge now is, can the Taliban rule? And then this is where the diplomacy is so important, because the Taliban can't rule in isolation, and they know that. And part of the success is due to the fact that they became very good at talking to other people in the last, it's been building for the last decade, but I'd say the last 5 years. I mean, they always had Pakistan's backing. And so the Taliban we noted they're a military force, very effective guerrilla force. They beat NATO. I mean, this still hasn't sunk in. I mean, the fact that they, with light arms, using suicide attacks, using mines, improvised explosive devices, machine guns. In recent years, they got sniper rifles, and from the summer they got American equipment on a broad scale, right? They have airplanes. They have a lot that they will be able to use eventually. But still, basically, it's a story of AK-47s, some American small arms, and mines. So it's very Ho Chi Minh, very old school guerrilla fighting, right? Mm-hmm. And they defeated the most powerful military alliance in world history, probably. So that has not yet sunk in, and what that means for American and global politics. And now they're trying to rule, right? They know they need international support. And their most consistent backer has been Pakistan, who sees them as an extension of Pakistani power. And this is very important for a Pakistani elite that, of course, is looking toward India. They want to have their rear covered, right? They want to make sure that these Pashtuns don't cause trouble for Pakistan. And they for some of the security forces, they like this vision of the Islamic State that the Taliban are building there, because those are not so distant from their views of what Pakistan should be. But the Taliban have been smart enough to kind of diversify their potential international allies. Mm-hmm. So everyone in the neighborhood has wanted the U.S. to leave, right? If we go back to 2001, there were Iranian and American special forces in the north working together against the Taliban to displace them, using Iranian, American, and then Afghan resistance forces against the Taliban. And that was a real moment of rapprochement if we go back to the missed exits. The relationship with Iran could have been different at that moment. But the U.S., under George W. Bush, devised this axis of evil language, put them together with their enemy, Iraq, and then North Korea. All that went south. That was a missed opportunity. But in recent years, the Taliban and Iran have kind of papered over the differences. They allowed the Taliban to open some offices on Iranian territory, likely shared some resources, some intelligence, some sophisticated weaponry. And then the Taliban went to Moscow. And for the Putin administration, they've long been worried that they see the Taliban as a kind of disease that will potentially move north, infect Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and maybe creep into Russia's sphere of influence. Maybe that's why they have a bunch of troops sitting in Tajikistan. I mean, the one forward base that Russia still has in Central Asia is in Tajikistan. And so the Taliban were always a worrying point, but also useful, because they could say, well, in case the Taliban get out of control, we need to be here. And so Tajikistan said, okay, you're helping secure us, and yes, it impinges upon our sovereignty, but it's okay, So Putin said, let's, give another black eye to the Americans, and let's, treat the Taliban as if they're the kind of government in waiting. Let's have them come to Moscow multiple times. This summer, for the last year or two, they've been talking to China, right? So the photographs of senior Taliban figures going from their office in Qatar, which was a major blow to the U.S.-backed government, the fact that they were able to open up an office in Qatar that at one point began to fly a flag of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, that basically said we're a state in the waiting. Yeah. And as the U.S.-backed Afghan government failed at ruling too, right? As they showed how corrupt they were, and as they really alienated more and more Afghans by committing acts of violence against them, by stealing from them, by, basically creating a kind of kleptocracy, right? The Taliban said, we are pure, we are not corrupt, and look at us. We're winning on the battlefield. And internationally, look, we're talking to China.
We're talking to Putin. We're talking to China.
Yeah.
We're a legitimate, powerful center of Central Asia.
And also kind of, hinting that, we have a website. I mean, the whole digital angle is amazing because they began to, and this is important actually, they had a website which grew more and more sophisticated. Again, after having, shot televisions and these kind of ceremonial killings of these infidel devices, right? They said, we have a government, we have commissions, we have a complaint line. They lifted all this technocratic language that you get from any UN document, about good governance and all the kind of, generic language that the NGO world has produced for us, right, in English. They reproduced that in 5 languages on their Taliban website. And of course, I'm not saying anyone believed this, but it was like, just put me in, coach. I know the playbook. I know how to run a government. And look, we have an agricultural commission. We have, a taxation system. And again, this idea, and then on the ground, they had their own law courts. And they would creep into a district, assassinate some people, the local authority figures, men of influence, talk to local clerics, either get them on board or kill them, and say, this state is corrupt, but we're bringing you justice. This is our calling card. Yeah. We're bringing public morality and justice. And then to a broader world, they said, things didn't go perfectly. The whole Al-Qaeda thing, wish we could have a do-over on that. We're not going to let anyone hurt you from our territory. We just want to rule. And people like us and look. And so if we look at the neighborhood, Iran, even the Central Asian states, after a while, recognized that they could make some money. I mean, one thing that Uzbekistan likes about the current arrangement, or they're not hostile to, is that they have all these contracts. They can potentially make some money from, the pipeline dream remains alive, running natural gas, oil to, eventually the Indian Ocean, to markets, beyond Central Asia. It's sitting on a couple $1 trillion probably in mineral resources that China would love to have, of course. And so people are looking at Afghanistan now after 20 years saying, under American rule, it was a basket case, right? There was immense human suffering, incredibly violent. The world did not start counting civilian casualties in Afghanistan until 2009. I mean, think about that. The war went on for 8 years. The Taliban were never really defeated. They just went to Pakistan. They went to the mountains. They went to the woods. And so all these different American operations, as you noted, under Bush, Obama, Trump, and so on, killed countless civilians. The U.S. never accounted for that. We never even counted. Trump escalated the civilian casualties by escalating the air war. But a lot of this was like very ugly, on the ground, night raid stuff where you drop into a hamlet and massacre people. And then you're not honest about what happened, right? So that dynamic continued to fuel the growth of the Taliban from below. So the foot soldiers, they never ran out of foot soldiers. I mean, the U.S. and its allies killed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Taliban fighters over the last 20 years. But they just sprouted up again. And part of that was the kind of solidarity culture, the male bonding of martyrology, of martyrdom and of revenge, and a sense of the foreign invader. And I've heard, I haven't taught a ton of U.S. military people, but through the Hoover, they put officers in our classes sometimes, and met a few wonderful Army and Marine officers who I really enjoyed. We came from the South like me, always had great rapport with them, and they expressed a range of opinions about this. I think that I learned a lot from some of them who said, yeah, I mean, I get that. I get why they hate us. I get why they're still fighting, because last week we just killed 14 of their fellow villagers. So the officers, the guys on the ground, fighting this war, we're not stupid about that. I mean, they got the human dimension of that, and yet no one got off the exit, as you said. People kept driving. But going forward now, internationally, it's critical that they have. I mean, they've had meetings. I mean, what the Taliban have done since August 15th is a lot of diplomacy. They've had meetings. They've had people. They've had Tashkent come. They've had Beijing come. They've had Moscow come. I mean, they've had major visits from Islamabad, from security people, from diplomatic circles. And they're counting on things being different this time. I mean, the first time around, the only people who backed the Taliban by recognition, giving them diplomatic recognition, were the Saudis, the Pakistanis, and the UAE. And because of Al-Qaeda, because of opium, because of some of the human rights stuff, the U.S. pushed everyone to let's not recognize the state. Even though the U.S. did. I mean, Colin Powell famously, the summer of 2001, we did give a few grants and aid to the Taliban as a kind of massaging negotiations. They kept talking about bin Laden, but they also wanted them to stop opium production. I mean, Afghanistan, throughout all this period we've talked about, is the global center of opium production. I mean, over the years, more and more of the Afghan economy, continued to today, is devoted to the opium trade.
Opium, which is the thing that leads to heroin.
Yep.
Some of the painkillers.
Yep. And even if Afghan poppies don't make it to Hoboken, that they are not the source of American deaths.
Yeah.
They are part of a universal market, a global market, which I think any economist will tell you is part of the story of our opium problem.
Something I read maybe a decade ago now, and I just kind of looked it up again to bring it up to see your opinion on this, is there's a 2010 report by the International Council on Security and Development that showed that 92% of Afghans in Helmand and Kandahar province know nothing of the 9/11 attacks on U.S. in 2001. Is this at all representative of what you know? Is this possible? So basically, put another way, is it possible that a lot of Afghans don't even know the reason why there may be troops, or the sort of American provided narrative for why there's troops, American soldiers and American drones overhead in Afghanistan?
Right. I mean, my gut response, not knowing the details of this actual poll, is that that's a very unhelpful way to think about how Afghans relate to the world. And I think it could be, if you go to my hometown in North Carolina, if you knock on some doors, you may meet people who don't know all kinds of things. I could probably walk around this neighborhood here in California, and there'd be all kinds of people who don't know all kinds of things. Kyrie Irving apparently thinks the earth is flat. I mean, so we could make a lot of certain kinds of ignorance, I think. But I think what I would say, and then there's also, a companion point may be that in thinking about the withdrawal, the collapse, the return of the Taliban, there's been a big conversation about, what do Afghans think of us, really? And this famous piece in the New Yorker was about how, many people like the Taliban, that many women interviewed, supposedly in this piece, were sympathetic because they'd lost family members and all the violence. And the idea kind of was that, we haven't thought about that at all. When in fact, of course we have, and lots of people have. But I think if you're just dropping into the conversation, if you look at the media arc of coverage of Afghanistan in the United States, the arc went from lots of coverage during, of course, 9/11 and its aftermath, lots of coverage during Obama's surge, and then quickly dropped down. The last decade has been almost nothing. So if you ask the same question about Americans or of Americans, I'm not sure what they would say to you. What percentage would actually know why the U.S. is in X, Y, or Z either, right? But I think on the Afghan side, just to return to that for a moment, I think we can fetishize these provinces. They are a kind of, a place where Taliban support has been greatest. Also where there's been the most violence, where the Americans have been most committed to trying to root out the Taliban movement.
This is Helmand and Kandahar.
Exactly, in the south.
What are the other parts? Yeah. It's in the south of Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it's mostly Pashtun, not exclusively, but mostly Pashtun, mostly rural.
What is Pashtun?
That's the ethnic group, that the Taliban claim to represent, right? Mm-hmm. So they are this group.
What other groups are there?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry. So in cities, you'll find everything, right, that is in Afghanistan. You'll find Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras. These are people who, Uzbek is a Turkic language, right? Most Uzbeks live in what is now Uzbekistan, but they form majorities in some northern parts of the country of Afghanistan. But what I emphasize is that, and you can find online an ethnographic map of Afghanistan, and you'll see green where Pashtuns live, red where Hazaras live, orange where Uzbeks live, purple where Tajiks live. Then there are a bunch of other smaller groups of different kinds. There are Nuristanis, there are Baluch, there are in different religious communities. There are Sunni, Shia, different kinds of Shia.
What are the key differences between them? Is it a religious basis from the origins of where they immigrated from, and how different are they?
Yeah, so they're all indigenous, I think. There's a kind of mythology that some groups have been there longer, right? So they have a greater claim to power. But historically, it's like, ethnic groups anywhere. People have different narratives about themselves. But many Pashtuns would tell you, not all, but many would say, we are the kind of state builders of Afghanistan. The dynasty that ruled much of the space, that was born in the mid-18th century, that ruled until 1973, more or less, generalizing, was a Pashtun dynasty. The Taliban have definitely said, to some audiences, we are the rightful rulers because we are Pashtun. Mm-hmm. The trick, though, is, I don't mean to be evasive, but just to convey some of the complexity, one quick answer as well. There are majorities and minorities. One finds that a lot along with those maps. But I would say suspend any firm belief in that, because that could be entirely wrong. In fact, there's never been a modern census of Afghanistan. So when journalists say Pashtuns are the majority, or they're the biggest group, I would say not so fast. I would say not so fast because of migration is one major issue. No major modern census. Actually, the Soviets got pretty close, but didn't quite, find something comprehensive, and didn't publicize it, knowing that it was, in modern times, ethnicity can be the source of political mobilization. It's not innately so, but it's been part of the story. But then you have mixed families, right? So a lot of people you'll encounter in the diaspora and around. I am, my one parent is Tajik, one is Pashtun, right? Or I'm Pashtun, as I mentioned before, but I don't speak Pashto, right? Or I am Hazara, but you read about us as Shi'i Hazaras. In fact, I'm a Sunni Hazara, or I'm a secular Hazara, or I'm an atheist Hazara. Everything's possible, right? Mm-hmm. One of my friends, if he were here, he'd say I'm Kabuli. I'm from Kabul. So if you think about it in Russian terms, it means a lot. If you're a Moskvich, if you're from Pittsburgh or Moskva,
Yeah, well, even here, there's Bostonians.
Yep, that's right.
Texans, Californians.
Yeah. East Coast, West Coast, all that stuff. So those are all part of the mix here. So you ask about Kandahar and Helmand, then I would say, if you go out to, a pomegranate, field, you'll meet a guy who may reckon time differently from you and me, who may not be literate. He may not have ever had a geography lesson. But if you go one door over, you may meet a guy who, whose life path has taken him to live in, 6 countries. Mm-hmm. He may speak 5 languages. And these are all things I'm not saying these are just because people have money and can go fly around. They're people who are displaced by war from late 1970s, right? Even already in the early 70s, people were traveling by the tens of thousands to Iran, as labor migrants. And once you get to Iran, once you get to Pakistan, once you get to Uzbekistan, you then connect to all kinds of cosmopolitan cultures. And in fact, I think one of the themes of the book, that you may or may not have read, it may put you to sleep. Afghan Modern was about, conceptualizing Afghanistan as a cosmopolitan place where for centuries people went on the move and trade in this area. You think of, I think this mischaracterization of places like Helmand and Kandahar, you fly in or you're part of a Marine battalion and you see people there and they look different. And I think in our imagination, if I can generalize, they look like they've been there for millennia, right? The dress, the whatever, right? You think of technology, you think of the mud compounds and so on. You think of, animal drawn transportation, that kind of stuff, right? Or the motorbike, right? At most is what they have. But in fact, if you follow those families, their trade has taken them to northern India for centuries, right? Their trade has connected them to cosmopolitan centers. Say they have a scholar in the family. That scholar may have studied all over the Middle East, South Asia, right? Their ancestors may have been horse traders who went all the way to Moscow, right? I mean, we have historical records of all these people traveling across Eurasia, pursuing all kinds of livelihoods. And so Afghanistan is this paradox of visually looking remote and looking like it's kind of stuck in time, but the family trajectories and the current trajectories are astoundingly cosmopolitan and mobile. And so, and a conception of being a world center is also quite strong. So, another way to frame that question about do they know about 9/11 would be why should we know about 9/11? Because we are at the center of something important, right? We are the center of Asia. We are the heart of Asia. We have a kind of historic greatness. We are, a proud culture of our own achievements, right? So we're not worried about that, right? That said, I mean, sure, there are different narratives about why Americans are there, why people are being killed. Of course you'd find, they want to convert us. They want our gold. They want our opium. They want X, Y, and Z, right? There was a recent story about a Taliban official sitting in an office in Kabul, and a journalist asked him, can you find in this rotating globe, find your country, find where are we sitting right now? And he was filmed not being able to do it. And so a lot of, very sophisticated Afghans in the diaspora were saying, haha, look at this. And that exists. I mean, I think I could go to my Stanford classroom and there'd be a lot of kids who wouldn't know where Afghanistan is too, right? But I guess I wouldn't use those metrics to suggest that this is a place that doesn't have a sense of its place in the world and of geopolitics. I think, if anything, being a relatively small country in a very complicated neighborhood, I mean, every cab driver, I mean, people have this is where America is different, because I don't think Americans have this sense. We're talking about Moscow and stuff. I think, Moscow cab drivers, I think a lot of them are going to tell you what's happening in the world and why, right? And it's just part of their thing, right? You can find that in Ghana. You can find that in Mexico City, right? You find that lots of places. So I think Afghans are part of a very sophisticated kind of mapping of the world and where they fit in. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them remarkably have done it firsthand, which is what struck me so much. And relaying my experiences from the 1990s in Tashkent places, that these guys had already lived in more countries than I'd ever been. They already knew half those languages. I mean, this one friend's Russian was impeccable. And of course it helped. They had Russian girlfriends. They had, they mixed with the police. They had run-ins. I mean, this wasn't something you got from a book, right? This was hard knock life. I mean, one friend was from a wealthy family in this trading diaspora, and he was imprisoned. I mean, they sent him to prison in Pakistan, and he talks about how he started running the jail, taking cigarettes to people, doing little things, and kind of, these are not stories of I went to Harvard and so I'm so learned because of this. I mean, it's a whole range of experiences.
The interesting thing is a survey is a survey, and it doesn't reflect ignorance, as you're saying, perhaps, but it may reflect a different geopolitical view of the world than the West has. Yeah. So if, for a lot of the world, 9/11 was one of the most important moments of recent human history. Yeah. And for Afghanistan not to know that, especially when they're part of that story, it means they have a very different, there could be a lot of things said. One is the spread of information is different, the channels of the way information is spread. And two, the things they care about. Maybe they see themselves as part of a longer arc of history, the bickering of these superpowers that seem to want to go to the moon are not as important as the big sort of arc that's been the story of Afghanistan. That's an interesting idea, but it's still a bit, if at all, representative of the truth.
Right.
It's heartbreaking that do not see themselves as active player in this game between the United States and and Central Asia, because they're such a critical player, and and obviously in many ways get the short end of the stick in this whole interaction with invasion of Afghanistan for many years, and then this rushed withdrawal of troops, and now the economic collapse, and it's sad in some ways.
No, it's I mean, another way to put it is this. There's a range of knowledge, and you're right. The information flows are peculiar to particular geographies and histories and stuff. And I think that plucking out one sample from some fairly remote area, from one like follow the agricultural products. I mean, and this is where I think urban-rural divides used to mean a lot more in the 19th century, right? So a lot of like the nuts and bolts of history is about conceiving of these kinds of distinctions, But I think that if one has the privilege of traveling a bit, you see that like urban areas are fed by rural hinterlands. And if you think of who actually, brings the bread, the milk, the pomegranates and so on, it creates these networks, and then, mobility channels, information and so on. But yeah, but your broader point about like the tragedy of this, I guess if I can quote a brilliant student of mine, an Afghan American woman who just received her PhD, who's now, doctor, who's a great scholar. We've done several events now trying to just think through what's happened. And of course, she's very emotionally affected by it. And she continues to ask a really great question. And if I can get her phrasing right, if you think of the cycle of like the Taliban being in power in 2001, in the way in which that affected women in particular, half Afghan, half of the society, right? Then you think of this 20-year period of violence and missed exits, right? And repeated tragedy. That also, it created a space. It created a space for a whole, I'd say generationally, it created a space for people to realize something new. And I think so we have to attend to the dynamism of the society, right? So yeah, this happened mostly in Kabul, other big cities, Mazar-i-Sharif, Herat, and Kandahar. But you can't limit your analysis to that because things like radio, television, everyone got a TV channel. There's a wonderful documentary called Afghan Star that I recommend to your listeners and viewers. That it's about a singing contest show. But you see, just for some of these things about like connections. It's a show by an independent, television network that did drama. It did kind of infomercials for the government and huge American investment in it. So it wasn't politically neutral, but it did talk shows, did all this kind of stuff. But it did a singing show that became, incredibly popular, modeled upon the British and American, American Idol kind of stuff, and you could vote. So it had a kind of democratic practice element. But it's fascinating to see that, people hooked up generators to televisions and watch this. You think of like literacy rates. Literacy rates are imperfect, and, people who study, medieval, modern Europe talk about how, no one could read and there weren't many books, but if someone had a book, it'd be read aloud to a whole village potentially, or gathering. So there was much, some of these metrics don't get what people actually receive as information or exposure, because there's the magnifying power of open spaces and hearing radio in group settings, seeing television group settings, having telephone, cheap telephones, which then become an access point to the world, and social media, right? So all this stuff swept across Afghan society as it did elsewhere, in the last decade or more. So Afghan society became, in important ways, really connected to everything going on. And so you see that reflected politically in what people wanted. So you had some people, obviously, back to return to the Taliban. Some people wanted the status quo, but increasingly, many more people wanted something else. And one of the great failures was to expose people to democracy, but only give them the rigged version. And so the U.S., the State Department in particular, continued to double down on faked elections for the parliament and for the presidency in Afghanistan.
What kind of elections?
Faked fraudulent elections for parliament and for president in Afghanistan again and again from the very beginning. And those elections were partly theater for the U.S., right, for remaining on the road that you're describing, right, for not deviating, for not exiting, because we were building democracy there. In reality, the U.S. government knew it was never really building democracy there. It was establishing control. And elections were one means to gather control, right? But then you had on the ground, especially among young people, going to university, having experiences that were denied to them before, they took these promises seriously. So part of the disillusionment that we see today is that, they believed what the U.S. told them, that they're constructing democracy. And of course, cynics like us may have been thinking, well, you're not really doing that. You're backing fraud.
They believed it when they were younger, and now they're actually smart enough to understand that it's a farce.
Yeah.
And so indirectly had the consequence of actually working.
Yeah.
In that it taught the young folk over a period of 20 years, young folks to believe that democracy is possible, and then to realize what democracy is not.
Exactly.
Which is the current system.
Beautifully said. And so, but now look at us. Now it's now November. And so this whole period, and I wouldn't say I wouldn't cast the last 20 years, if we're looking at all the achievements, I wouldn't put them in an American tally sheet like, oh, this is something we should pat ourselves on the back for. I think that much of this happened actually against what the Americans wanted. I mean, the kind of free-thinking, democracy-wanting, even we could point to on the religious, go back to the religious sphere. I mean, the Afghan religious landscape became very pluralistic. Lots of young people wanted a different kind of secular politics. But the old guard who wanted the status quo and wanted something that they'd fought for in the 1980s tended to still get American backing as the political elites who still tended to monopolize political power. So all stuff was happening in different ways. I mean, the Americans established this American University of Afghanistan, which is, I think, one of the best things the U.S. did there. And I regret that the U.S. didn't fund 20 more, sprinkling them across the country, making them accessible to people, because it was, again, it wasn't an engine of Americanization. It was just opportunity. And so the thirst for higher education was really extraordinary there. It was never really met. The U.S. tended to put money in primary education, which much of that too was fraudulent. But so you have all this interesting dynamism. You have, the arts, you have a critical space. I mean, I call it a public sphere in the classic European sense. The Afghans made of their own. And again, it wasn't Americanization. It wasn't imposed. It was something that Afghans built across generations, but really with a firm foundation among youth who wanted, importantly, a multi-ethnic Afghan society. You asked about Pashtuns and that kind of stuff. And a lot of that language in recent years was they were aware that the U.S.-backed government was playing ethnic politics and trying to kind of put people into blocks and mobilize people based on their ethnic identity. And there was a younger cohort of people who said, we are Afghan. And there's interesting social media stuff where people would say, I am Hazara, but I'm also Tajik. I'm also Uzbek. I mean, it was a way of creating a multi-ethnic Afghan national identity that embraced everything. I mean, very utopian, super utopian, right? But symbolically, it's very important that they rejected being mobilized politically, voting as a Hazar or voting as whatever. And of course, there were communities who wanted to, vote as that ethnic community. But there are also people who said, let's put a kind of civic nationalism first, one that accommodates ethnic pluralism in a way that rejected a kind of majoritarian politics of one ethnic group dominating the thing. So all this stuff was quite interesting. I mean, women were asserting themselves across multiple spheres. Of course, it remained patriarchal. Of course, there were struggles. Of course, there was violence. Of course, this is no utopia. But the door on all that shut on August 15. So to go back to the quote that I wanted to offer from the student, now professor, was that, in trying to make sense of this, and you mentioned the tragic arc here, if you take the 20 years, like she asked, why did you go to war in our country? Basically, why did you do this to us for 20 years when this was never about us? You never asked us if you wanted to come. You never asked us what you wanted to build here. You didn't ask us when you were coming, and you didn't ask us when you were leaving. You just did this all on your own. And we tried to make the most of it. And then you pulled the rug out from under us, at the 11th hour, and returned to power partly by diplomacy. It wasn't, at the end, just a military loss. I mean, it was a series of diplomatic decisions. I mean, the idea, you asked about alternatives. I mean, giving up Bagram. I mean, holding to the timeline. I mean, the Biden people did not need to hold to the Doha agreement that Trump had signed. I mean, every American president writes his or her own foreign policy, right? So the Biden administration acted as if, and they tried to convince us that their hands were tied, and that it was either this or 20 more years of war or some absurd kind of, false alternative. And so, but I think that's important for American audiences to hear that, they're like, you came here to experiment. You came here to punish. You came here to kind of reassert, your dominance on the world stage, to work out the fear and hurt of 9/11 that we talked about, which was so real, and palpable, and so important for American politics since then. Like you worked out your problems, on us, on our territory. And now what do we have for it? And then the people who had a stake in that system, imperfect as it was, have been desperate to leave. And so this, I don't know how much people are aware of this, but, I'm a scholar. I work in California. I have friends. I edited a journal on Afghanistan, and, but I'm not a politician. I'm not a soldier. But people assume that, Afghans have been desperately trying to reach me and anyone who is kind of on the radar as an American to help get them out. And that's the kind of like, the symbol of voting with your feet, is quite powerful. I mean, there's a huge swath of society that doesn't want the system and is literally living in terror about it. Naturally, women, especially women of a certain age, they feel like their lives are over. I mean, there is an epidemic of suicide. They feel betrayed, and some people have done some good things in getting people out. Some, the U.S. military vets have been, at the forefront of working to get out people, that they know they owe. But the U.S. government doesn't want these people. I mean, they have created all these obstacles to allowing a safety valve for people to leave.